I didn't even have a chance to get a book, which is fine. It's fine. But I'll say this up front. If you've not been in any of my classes in a while or never been to one of my classes, the book is a guide for you to study at home, okay? We're not going to go through the book in class like, Dan, answer question number 3, and then Rob, you get question number 4. True or false? What is that? We're not going to do that. It is you take the book and use it as your at-home study guide so that you can come into class prepared for the discussion that we're going to have about the sections of text or the stories that we're going to be taking a look at. So that in no way devalues the book. It's important for you to have that structure for yourself, especially for kind of books like Ezra and Nehemiah that are just sometimes a little inaccessible for us. So we'll start off this way, okay? Without having studied the book in advance, without having a guidebook for you, what are some possible reasons why Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're going to focus on just Ezra and Nehemiah for now. We're going to study Esther later on in the quarter. I just want to focus on Ezra and Nehemiah. What makes this book a little bit, what kind of makes it inaccessible? What's challenging about this book for us?
Names.
Okay, a lot of names. Yeah, a lot of names that are hard to pronounce. It's one of those books. It's kind of like First Chronicles or Numbers, right? You start, okay, I'm going to read Numbers today. My Bible read. I'm going to go read Numbers. Then you're like, skip. And First Chronicles is the same way. You jump into First Chronicles, like, okay, great. First Chronicles is like, oh, so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so, who is the son of so-and-so. And it's a lot. And listen, Ezra starts off very promising. You're like, ooh, Cyrus. Okay, they're all going home. Then you get to chapter 3, like, oh, no, it's one of those books again. Lots of names and lots of numbers. Yeah, and they're hard to pronounce. So listen, let's be honest about it. It's just, that does make it a little bit challenging for us to, like, dive into a book that we immediately are met with this obstacle of, here's a whole bunch of names and a whole bunch of numbers. And it is kind of hard to kind of get through that. Peggy, you got a thought?
Yes. One reason was because Ezra was a scribe, so we also need to know in his writings that he was a descendant of Aaron. You have to be a priest to be able to even function as a leader in the church. The worship that.
So, one of the reasons why it's a little challenging is that when you're reading a book that's written by an expert, maybe in a field that you're not super familiar with, can those books feel a little bit inaccessible? Like, what if I handed you a book and said, this is the preeminent text on neurosurgery? Here, Lida, enjoy that. This is like, the author of this book is the preeminent expert in the world on neurosurgery. Is that going to feel like kind of an inaccessible text to you? Yeah, and so because Ezra describes himself in chapter 7 later on, he describes himself as being an expert in the law. He says a scribe in the law who is very capable of teaching all the things concerning the law. The guy is an expert. It's the reason why he is sent to Jerusalem, because he is an expert in the law, in all the minutia of the priesthood and the sacrifices and the cleanliness laws. And if you're not really up to speed on your Leviticus, then sometimes what Ezra has to say, again, can feel a little bit inaccessible. What about the history? In what way does the history sort of make Ezra and Nehemiah a little bit challenging for us? Yeah, Mike?
You have a people that are excited about going back and rebuilding something that's not, applicable as much to us. They're excited about repopulating Jerusalem and rebuilding a wall, and it's like, oh, okay, well, none of that stuff is exactly relevant anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, so take, over by the Liberty Bowl, there's a basketball arena called the Memorial Coliseum, right? Now, I'm not from Memphis. Who in here remembers going to see basketball games at Memorial? Okay?
That's actually the Mid-South Coliseum.
Mid-South. Okay, thank you. Mid-South.
I wasn't going to correct that.
Well, Mid-South Coliseum. Okay, see, Rob's got it. Now, for how many decades have they been talking about what are we going to do with this Coliseum? What are we going to do with it? Because it's kind of derelict and it's not really used for anything anymore. And every time someone says, well, why don't we just tear the thing down? The old-timers in town come in and say, you can't do that! That's the Coliseum! All the games are played there, all the memories. Now, if I'm not from Memphis and I look at the Coliseum and it's kind of an eyesore and I go, why don't you just tear it down? That's not a big deal to me because I don't have any of the memories. So, Mike, you're absolutely right. This is the story of we're going to go back to Jerusalem and we're going to rebuild the temple and we're going to build the walls and we're going to reinstitute the Passover and the Feast of Booths and we read it like, I guess I don't get it. I just don't get it. I don't know what the fascination is with all of this. And again, we get it in an intellectual sense. We understand why they do it, but we just don't. We don't have the personal connection to all of this. We weren't there. We were not the ones who were taken from our homes as children and then taken to Babylonian captivity for 50 or 60 or even 70 years for some of them. So it is hard to really feel like you can jump in the story because it's just some of that stuff is a little, just impersonal to us. And then, of course, there's the history. I was asking about the history. Like if you don't know who Cyrus is or Darius or Artaxerxes, if you don't really understand, how Assyria gave way to Babylon, which gave way to the Persians and the Medes, and again, without the history, it can seem a little like you're sort of lost in history. Like, I don't know the difference between 1500 BC and 500 BC. You could tell me any date, I just don't. The dates don't matter. And listen, some people don't like that. And Rebecca will admit to you, dates are just like, I've kind of ragged on you a little bit today, haven't I? I would say, to be very clear, Rebecca is, in fact, much smarter than I am. She was a valedictorian in high school, okay? This is a girl who got a full ride scholarship to college because of how smart she was, okay? But there's just stuff that we know or don't know, and to her, she'll tell you like dates or you could say 1750 or 1850, and she'd be like, wait, which one was World War II? Oh, there's like three people in the room left, so you're actually in good company. Yeah, I know. This is a rough day. Get a little hot in here. Right? No respect. Peggy, go ahead.
One other thing about the history is that all this time God was trying to teach them how to be a monotheistic God.
Yeah.
Because they lived in a society where many gods or many things.
Yeah.
And so now they're going to be able to take this to Babylon, and those people will see how God's people actually live, think, work, worship, things like that.
Yeah. The religious climate of the time is actually one of the things that contributes to the political and military climate of the time as well. It's one of the reasons why Cyrus is able to take over, because of the way that he handles religion in his empire is very different from the way that the Assyrians in particular and the Babylonians to a lesser extent. So what I've handed out to you is I've printed off a few timelines. Again, because I don't have a book also, I don't know what's in the book as far as timelines and maps and that sort of thing. So at least for our purposes, until we all have a book and we're all looking at the same thing, I just printed off some timelines and some maps for you just to kind of ground you in where are we in history right now. So roughly we're looking at this time period here on this timeline. Jeremiah, right? We know Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet in Jerusalem and Judah before the Babylonian captivity. And his job is to warn the people, you guys have got to reconcile with the fact that God's punishment is coming. And Jeremiah prophesies that Babylon is going to come and there will be 70 years where Babylon is going to deport you and despoil your country and displace you, and 70 years. And at the end of 70 years, you will be brought back by God and restored to your homeland. Okay? Jeremiah's life ends in relative obscurity after failure after failure after failure to appeal to the people's better judgment. Eventually, what does Nebuchadnezzar decide to do to Jerusalem? When he's just kind of had enough. 586 BC, what does Nebuchadnezzar finally say? Enough is enough. And what does he do? He destroys Jerusalem. Like he's done. That's actually the third time. 605, 597, and then 586, or maybe 587, depending on Dates, by the way, when you're talking 2,500 years ago, dates can be a little bit squishy. So we're not going to be super firm on the date, give or take a year. Okay, but this is the third time now. This is the third time that Nebuchadnezzar has had to deal with Jerusalem, and he says, "I'm done. I'm finished." And he tells his captain Nebuzaradan to just level the city, take everybody out, destroy the city completely. And so in this series of deportations, okay, you have really the wealthy and the skilled, and anybody who has any kind of talent is taken away from Jerusalem and sent where? Where do they go? They go to Babylon, right? They go to Babylon. And that is Daniel and Ezekiel, okay? Daniel and Ezekiel are both prophets in the land of Babylon during this period of captivity. Near the end of Daniel's life, this is where we get to the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, okay? Near the end of Daniel's life. Daniel is an old man. His years are coming to a close, and the political climate changes for Babylon. Because of a lot of internal strife, Babylon's empire is beginning to crumble and fall apart. We'll get to that a little bit later and the reasons why. Eventually, Babylon gives way to which next great empire? The Persians, right? Yeah, the Persians allied with the Medes. The Medes and the Persians, under Cyrus gives equal legal status to the Persians as well as the Medes. It was a very masterful move on his part because he is Persian, and yet he defeats the Medes and loops them in not as defeated foes, but as equals in his empire. And it's like, listen, that is a stroke of genius right there. And the Peds and the Mersians, the Persians and the Medes defeat Babylon, and they actually enter the city of Babylon in a relatively bloodless entrance because the Babylonians actually consider Cyrus to be their liberator for several reasons, one of which is partially religious. And so this is where we get here in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Cyrus gives permission for any displaced peoples in his empire to go home. He says, listen, if you were taken 50 years ago from your homeland and you don't like living here in Babylon, then you may go home with my blessing. Absolutely, go on home. Yeah, Brian?
So it's not just the Jews.
It's not just the Jews.
Okay.
It's a empire-wide policy that he enacts. Displaced peoples are allowed to go on home. Now, of course, Ezra's focus is on interaction with the Jews. That's the focus of his story. And so with that, a little over, yeah, go ahead, Peggy.
That decree that he made was from a prompting from the Lord.
Yes.
An answer to a prophecy where he said, he made a promise that in 70 years he was going to send them back.
Yeah, and it's Jeremiah 29 and then Isaiah 44 and 45. In Isaiah 44 and 45, Cyrus is named. He's specifically named that I'm going to raise up Cyrus as a Messiah, okay? As a Messiah who will come and essentially rescue you. Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
This was all prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream.
Yeah.
Told by Daniel.
Yeah, the statue.
The statue of all the changes that were going to happen.
Yes, Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Then the chest and the arms are these two kingdoms, the Persians and the Medes, who joined together to defeat the Babylonians, and they're the next great empire. Peggy?
So, with my sister Peggy over there, if you really want to get excited about this, Isaiah 41, by God called Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
Cyrus was not a monotheistic believer.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you want to get excited about the book, just read Isaiah 41 and 45 and how God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that he can... Is he able to use Nebuchadnezzar for his purposes? Absolutely. Is he able to use Cyrus? Absolutely. And of course, the cool thing, if you, again, like Peggy says, if you want to get excited, one of the things that excites me, a touch point for me, because I love history. I'm a big student of history. I think history is very cool. But I love that the Bible is a story that exists right there in history. Like, The Bible is not Middle Earth or Narnia, okay? It's not a fantasy land that doesn't exist. It's like the Bible story takes place like this is a real place and this thing happened in this real place. And here's a real place and this thing happened in this real place. And here's a person that you can read about in any secular history book. Oh, and also while we're at it, you could, if you felt like going to Iran, I don't, but if you feel like going to Iran, you know whose tomb you can go visit? Cyrus's tomb. You can go see Cyrus's tomb. You can see the cities that he built, Pasargadae and Persepolis, and you can go see these amazing cities that Cyrus had a hand, and Darius and Artaxerxes all had a hand in building. Like, these are real people in a real time period, in real places, and the story of God and His people is interwoven throughout real history, which I think is just very engaging to me. Yeah, Gary, and then we'll move on.
So you mentioned that. So, like, is this side of people, are they kind of like the precursors of the Muslim faith? You mentioned
no.
Iran, that kind of area.
No, because the birth of Islam was more among Arab tribes further south. We're talking about like modern day Iran and like modern day Iran, Persia, religiously speaking, was as different from Islam as it is from Judaism. I mean, it was polytheistic. They worshipped a sun god and a moon god, Marduk and Sin and other gods as well. So it was very much a polytheistic ancient religion. That's, again, it's as related to Islam as it would be related to Judaism or Christianity. Okay, let's go and move on. So I've got a couple of things that I printed for you. And again, these are just for you to kind of tuck in your notes, tuck in your Bible, so you just have it handy. I gave you a basic outline and structure of Ezra. Chapters 1 and 2 is the return of the first wave of people. It's about 42,000 of them return. Chapters 3 through 6 is about reestablishing the temple, building the foundation, opposition to that, and why did it take 20 years for them to get around and finally, finish rebuilding the temple? Then we get to presumably where Esther fits into the story. Esther's going to be our own thing that we're going to study later on. I want to study Ezra and Nehemiah as one unit because in the Hebrew Bible, until the Middle Ages, it was one book. Ezra and Nehemiah is not two books. It's one book. So we're going to look at Esther later. Chapters 7 and 8, we actually meet Ezra for the first time in chapter 7, and he goes to Jerusalem. Chapters 9 and 10 is his reformation work, right? He's there trying to revitalize the spiritual picture in Jerusalem. He's trying to root out some pretty serious sin problems that they've got. Nehemiah as well. Nehemiah comes along, and while Ezra's job was to restore the religious function of Jerusalem, Nehemiah's job is to come in and restore the safety and the civic function of Jerusalem. And so we'll get to Nehemiah a little bit later on. I don't want to spend too much of our time today, but Nehemiah's main job, sent from the Persian Empire, is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and restore the civic function of the city. And that would include things like the Sabbath day. He discovered that people were working on the Sabbath day, and there were non-Jews who were coming into the city with their wares, trying to set up markets on the Sabbath day, and he just kind of like, no, enough of that, we're done with this. He finds out that the temple was being used as basically a rental home for some unsavory figures. Right? Tobiah, like he had a bunch of run-ins with Tobiah. Sanballat and Tobiah spend the whole first half of the book giving Nehemiah nothing but trouble, and then he finds out, you mean Tobiah's got a room in the temple? No. And he takes all of Tobiah's junk and throws that in the street. So that's kind of the overview of Nehemiah. And I also provided a map, which we'll get to a little bit later. We'll fast track this a little bit here. I don't want to dwell too much because there's a big point at the end that I want to save 5 or 10 minutes to talk about here. We would need to start pretty far back if we want to talk about what's the real meaning of this book. What's the real background behind it? You could even go all the way back to the beginning of human history. And the Bible is a story on repeat of God's unwavering commitment to His people in spite of their failures. How many stories in the Bible basically just read like, and so the people sinned against God, and God did something in response, and the people cried out, and so God came and rescued them. so that the people could then fall back into sin. How many stories in the Bible are just that? Just rinse and repeat. Lather, rinse, and repeat over and over and over again. That's really the story of the Bible. It is a disappointing book in a lot of ways. It's an anticlimactic book full of disappointments. Okay? And every time, I don't know if this is my next slide or not, every time you feel like Israel is maybe going to turn a corner and be like, okay, they're going to get it this time. Like, I'm rooting for you guys. They don't. And it's just failure after failure after failure. I mean, if you think about it, even the highest highs in the Old Testament are almost always quickly, like, reined back in by some really stupid decision that's made by somebody. Some big sin that gets, it's like, and so it was victory, and they won the battle, and everything was great. Right? And then Gideon decided to take a bunch of gold and make a gold ephod, and Israel worshipped it. Oh, come on, guys! It's like every single story plays out like that. From Eden to Babel, to the patriarchs, to Moses and Aaron and the Israelites, and Numbers. Numbers is frustrating. We were reading Numbers in our daily Bible reading the last couple of weeks, and it's just like, it is a very frustrating book. Very. The judges, Saul, David, divided kingdom, the futility of the preaching of the prophets, and now these people returning from captivity. So, when the kingdom divided, here's your map, just kind of get the lay of the land. Who took Israel away into captivity? Assyria did. And unlucky them. If you think Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon were bad to Judah, whew, those Assyrians were nasty.
And they never came back.
And that's right. They were never restored. In fact, there's even language that you find even in modern Judaism that talks about the so-called lost tribes of Israel. That they were taken and just dispersed and just gone. Yeah. The Assyrians absolutely devastated their enemies. They conquered you and then skinned you alive and then flayed you and then used your skull as lawn ornaments. And they boiled people, and it's like, they were absolutely sadistic, brutal people who dominated. And so Judah, of course, Babylon did. And of course, Babylon had their own atrocities. It was, after all, ancient warfare. It is what it is. And there were certainly atrocities as well. You don't get to the top of the heap by being nice to people back then. It just is what it is. So we have the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, and it really reached its zenith under Nebuchadnezzar. For everything that he did and for as glorious as his empire was, when he died, instability almost instantly came about. There were palace coups and assassinations and people put on the throne who had no business being on the throne. And through a series of just really, really weak kings who badly administered the empire, Babylon just sort of like rotted from the inside out. And the kicker for all of it was the last Babylonian emperor named Nabonidus. And Nabonidus had this idea in his head that he was going to forsake the god Marduk, who was the traditional favorite god of Babylon, in favor of Sin, another god. And Nabonidus would not show up in Babylon for like the great moon god festivals, which was like, that's like your job, man. Every year it was his job to come and like, I don't know, literally hold the hand of an idol. I don't know, but it was his job to come for a festival in Babylon and in some way receive the blessing from Marduk, okay? And he never did. He just like, he left and he went and did other stuff and like purposefully avoided doing that. And the Babylonians were furious with him because he was making their favorite god a second-class citizen. And that was when Cyrus came in. Cyrus was a liberator to the Babylonians because they said, we don't like this Nabonidus guy. He does not worship the right God. He's making all of us mad. And Cyrus comes in, and Cyrus actually comes into the city of Babylon and shows his fealty to, let me see if I've got the quote here. So shows his fealty to Marduk in 537 BC. It says, there was a New Year's ceremony, and Cyrus comes in 537 BC, and he took the hand of Marduk and legitimated his status as rightful king of Babylon. This act betokened no special devotion to Marduk on Cyrus's part, but he was sensible enough to realize the rich dividends of submission and even gratitude would accrue from such an inexpensive policy of outward respect. And I just want to read one thing here. In this respect, as in many more, Cyrus's conception of empire was widely different from Assyria's or even Babylon's. Cyrus, whose personal religious views are not easy to determine, had no intention of offending any of his subjects' religious susceptibilities. On the contrary, he would conciliate these susceptibilities by playing the part of a worshiper of their various gods. And there's a quote here from one scholar that says, "The great king had no objection to bowing in the house of Rimmon if there was anything to be picked up on the floor." Think about that. He had no problem bowing in the house of a god if there was something to be picked up from the floor. And what that means is, if he could gain something by coming and bowing before the great god Gary, and if there was anything that he could gain by bowing before that god, any political clout, any credibility with people, any of their submission, he's like, listen, I'll worship any god if it'll get me the political points that I need to stay on top. That's essentially what he did. And many suspect that when he gives this decree to let the Jews go, that this was just one in a series of similar kinds of decrees to people to win the political favor of his people. After all, where the Assyrians and Babylonians dominated their empire and displaced you, the best way to keep Wayne and Lida submissive to Emperor Orion is to separate them, right? And I'll make Lida sit on that end of the room, and Wayne, you go sit on that end of the room. That way you two can't collude. You can't work together to overthrow me. And so that's what Assyria and Babylon did, is to make sure that everybody stayed submissive. They would take all the people that they conquered and just shuffle them around. Just shuffle them around. Cyrus believed the best way to run an empire was to make people love you. So he told people, listen, go home, worship your gods, build your homes, build your temples. You have my blessing. I'll even, listen, from the imperial treasury, I'll even support you. I'll build your temples for you. And it worked, because the Achaemenid dynasty lasted for centuries, where Babylon fell very quickly because it was based on fear and punishment and overlording subjects. Cyrus's Achaemenid dynasty lasted for several hundred years because of the good administration of his empire. And he is widely regarded to this day as one of the original true statesmen. In fact, Thomas Jefferson and a number of our own founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson loved Cyrus. Alexander the Great loved Cyrus. He thought Cyrus was all that because he was a benevolent statesman. Yeah,
that's what I was going to ask. It sounds like similar way that Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire did. Mm-hmm. They lasted a long time, Romans.
Yeah. Yeah, because as long as, listen, for a while, I might be able to keep Wayne and Lida submissive for a while, but after a while, what are they going to do? They're going to rise up in revolt. They're going to get tired of it. They're going to find a way to make it happen. All right, so let's skip on through here. We already got to this. Cyrus, born about 580 BC, he becomes the king of the Persians and rebels against the Medes around 550 BC. But again, once he actually defeats the Medes with a smaller force, which kind of shows his military genius. He's a very intelligent tactician. And he defeats the Medes, but instead of dominating them, he says, listen, I will become the king of the Medes, and you will have equal status, equal legal status in my empire. Persians and Medes, you will come together. There will be no second-class citizens as far as Persians and Medes go. And the Medes went, okay, sounds fair. So they end up conquering Babylon in 539 BC. 537 BC, he allows the displaced peoples to return their homes, including a little over 40,000 Jews, 42,360 specifically in Ezra chapter 2, and encourages them to rebuild the temple. He's considered a master statesman and military leader as well. The light purple is under Cyrus at its kind of greatest extent, this area here. So we're talking essentially from modern-day India, like at least from the border to modern-day India, all the way into modern-day Turkey, and even maybe touching a little bit of Greece there. Those who follow after him, including Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius the Great, they expand the empire even further to include parts of modern-day Greece, going all the way up into Europe, Egypt. I mean, it's a massive, massive empire, and it lasts for a long time. The Persian Empire, get this, from 530, right, does not fall until 330 BC, and that's at the hands of Alexander the Great. Several hundred years of relative peace and stability. And it was a time of advancement, civic advancement. Under Cyrus and those who came after him, there's a postal system, a very innovative, efficient postal system that's created in the Persian Empire. Roads and highways are built, maintained, and also advanced. He creates a system of satrapies, where essentially it's such a big empire that he subdivides it into 4 different satrapies, where a satrap essentially runs that part of the empire, but then there are what we might call federal officers from him. The federal officers kind of watch over the satrapy while the satrap runs it like he's kind of the sub-king. And so it's a very efficient civic system that he creates, and that also contributes to the organization and longevity of the Achaemenid dynasty. Ezra and Nehemiah specifically, in the Hebrew Bible, it is one book. It is part of what's called the writings. In the Hebrew Bible, the Jews, organize their Bible into 3 sections. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah. The next set of books is called the prophets. Did I print off? No, I don't think I did. I meant to put in the little handout a chart that shows how the Hebrew Bible is arranged. But they have the law, the prophets, and the other writings, essentially. And the law is the first 5 books of the Bible. It's the Torah. The prophets would include 1st and 2nd Samuel as well. And the minor prophets. The minor prophets were called the 12. They're one book in the Hebrew Bible. Okay. So there's only 24 books in the Hebrew Bible, but the minor prophets are all just part of one book, and Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. And then the writings are the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are all part of the writings. So what's the first thing that they do is they enthusiastically set up the foundation of a new temple. That's what the first part of Ezra is all about. What ends up happening, though? They neglect the project. They're persecuted by some of the locals. Who are the locals in chapter 4 who persecute them? Do we really know who they are in chapter 4? What are some hints or clues that you get about in chapter 4? Who discourages the workers in Jerusalem? Any guesses?
Samaritans.
Probably Samaritans, yeah. You have some northerners who come down to Jerusalem and they're like, hey, guys, I think we're like second cousins or something, right? I think we're related to each other. Listen, love this idea of building a new temple in Jerusalem. Great idea. We're all on board with it. We would love to be part of your big building project because we're basically like you. Boy. How did Zerubbabel and Joshua handle that? They say, you have absolutely no part in this. You have no connection to us. You are not allowed to help us rebuild the temple. And they rebuffed their offer to come and help. And so these northerners are a little bit upset about that. So they go about colluding with the local officials from Persia, and they shut the whole thing down. Basically, they just come in. You remember the guy from the EPA from the first Ghostbusters movie? And he just comes in, and he's like, you're operating all this equipment without a permit. Just shut it down. And they're like, you don't want to shut that down. Yeah, shut it all down. And they shut it down, and all the ghosts come out and cause a great big riot. Okay? Everybody's seen Ghostbusters, right? Please tell me you've seen Ghostbusters, right? That's essentially what they do, is they come into the temple and they say, if you're not going to let us help you build it, then we're going to get you all shut down on a bunch of red tape from the government. We're going to stop this thing dead in its tracks and say, wait a minute, you have all the proper permits here to do this thing? Building a temple sounds a little iffy to me. Let's call back to headquarters and see if you've got all the paperwork. And they end up neglecting the temple for 18 years. 18 years. So who comes along? Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai and Zechariah prophesy to the people and say, you guys got to get back to work. This is ridiculous. Haggai says, you live in your paneled houses. You spent 18 years building nice houses for yourself. But look, the temple is nothing but a foundation. You neglected God's house while you worried about your own lives. You guys have got to get back to work. And because of Haggai and Zechariah, the people are encouraged to rebuild the temple. With the temple completed, Ezra shows up, and it was essential to properly follow procedure. So, Ezra, the priest, comes in around 457 BC. He's sent from Babylon to teach the people the law, and Ezra 7 verse 6 says that he is an expert when it comes to things of the law. Later on in the book, chapters 9 and 10, he is appalled by the sins of the people, including intermarriage with foreign women. We will get to that when we get to that, because I think there's some complicating things to that story that we sometimes, maybe some assumptions that we make about it. In short, I will say the issue is not so much the ethnic or racial makeup of the women that they've married. The issue is, are these women still worshiping the pagan gods? Like, that's the real problem, okay? Because we have examples in the Old Testament of non-Jews marrying into Jewish families or Jewish husbands, Jewish wives, and there's no problem with it because, like Ruth the Moabitess, as a perfect example, she comes in and says, your God will be my God, right? She essentially, what we may call, converts to Judaism. The law, even in Exodus, includes provisions about when the foreigner comes and the foreigner wants to be part of the nation of Israel, as long as he's circumcised and keeps the law, he's to be regarded as a Jew, a full Israelite, as long as that person has been circumcised. So there's some assumptions that we make that I think are not, that maybe provide some problematic thinking on Ezra 9 and 10. About 15 or so years later, 445 BC, Nehemiah is dispatched to Jerusalem on a mission to rebuild the walls. And in this time period, the walls are extremely important. It not only provides civic pride, but it also literally provides safety to the people who live there. Once accomplished, he also set about revitalizing the moral and spiritual condition of the people. Nehemiah strictly enforces the Sabbath, cleanliness laws, public reading of the scriptures, and keeping festivals like the Feast of Tabernacles and Passover. Okay, so that's your big overview. That's your big introduction. Yeah, Brian.
So who wrote these two books?
Probably Ezra and Nehemiah.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, that's both in Hebrew and in Christian tradition, universally, in Judaism as well as in Christian tradition.
It's not stated in there.
It's not specifically stated, although both Ezra and Nehemiah do speak of themselves in the first person at different points. Ezra, for example, in Ezra chapter 7 and verses 27 and 28, he does speak in the first person there. In verse 28, he says, and God has extended loving kindness to me before the king and his counselors and before all the king's mighty princes. Thus I was strengthened according to the hand of the Lord my God, and I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me. So Ezra speaks in the first person. Nehemiah also, throughout his book, speaks in the first person. Quite famously, ending his book in the very last chapter, in chapter 13, essentially his last words are, God, remember me, I did my best. I tried. So, according to tradition, Ezra and Nehemiah both wrote these books, but they were, like I said, combined into one volume. So what's really the point of Ezra and Nehemiah? Here's one big lesson that I learned. When heroes are needed most, often it's just the regular people who rise to the occasion. And some of the heroes that we read about, Zerubbabel and Joshua, we don't really know a lot about Zerubbabel before. Like, he comes from a kingly line. His maybe grandfather, maybe with Jewish genealogy, father, grandfather, son, grandson, or some is a little bit iffy because they didn't have different words for son and grandson. But he comes from the kingly line of Jeconiah. So, but does that mean that he lived a privileged life in Babylon? Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know whether he lived this. His life was hard enough that when he was given the chance to go live a hard life in Jerusalem, he took it. So, I mean, if that says something like, if your current life is such that if I tell you, hey, I need some volunteers to go to this war-torn city full of rubble and miscreants and poor people, and you go, I would like to go. I'll volunteer. It probably says something about your life. That's just me making supposition, though. Joshua comes from a priestly line, or Jeshua, depending on your translation. Joshua and Jeshua are the same person. He comes from the priestly line, but like, it's not like these guys appear to be great heroes or famous people or anything like that. They volunteer to go. And they get there, and someone needs to get the job done, and they get the job done. We don't really know a lot about Nehemiah, except what does Nehemiah do for a living in Babylon or in Persia? He's a cupbearer. Now, that's not an unimportant job. Let's be clear. The cupbearer was the last line of defense for the king's life, okay, or the emperor's life. That if anybody was going to poison their food or their drink, the cupbearer would be the last person to touch the food and sample the wine. And so it's not like it was an unimportant job to be a cupbearer, but he's still a cupbearer, okay? He's still a cupbearer.
He was expendable.
He was expendable. Yes, he was expendable. He was not a politician. He was not a viceroy or some advisor to the emperor. He was the cupbearer. That was his job, okay? Esther, what about her? What do we know about Esther? She's kind of just a girl from obscurity. Like, she's just a girl. She happens to be very, very beautiful. She's very beautiful, but she and her family, her uncle Mordecai, or maybe cousin Mordecai, again, uncle and cousin are kind of different words. They're kind of gray area in Hebrew language, but Esther's she's just a girl. And she has an opportunity to do something amazing. I think that is really what these stories are about, is these are normal people who took on monumental challenges. They crossed, literally, geographically, they crossed empires. They crossed deserts on camelback. They built cities and raised up walls. They faced enemies. They spoke candidly to emperors. I mean, you think about Nehemiah building up the courage to talk to the emperor. Like, normally, he just sits there and samples the wine, and that's about it. But he builds up the courage to talk to the emperor. Esther has to build up the courage because she knows if she just walks into the room without being summoned by him, he could raise the scepter or lower the scepter. He could have her killed in an instant for her impunity. And yet she walks in because it's the right thing to do. And maybe faces death to go talk to the emperor. And I think these are just, again, incredible stories. Each of them contributed to the spiritual and material renewal of God's people, fulfilling some part of a divine plan. And yet, they all point to something bigger than themselves. Because, for as great as Ezra was, Ezra 9 and 10 clearly shows that there was kind of an anticlimactic, wow, there's a lot of sin here. Nehemiah is the same way. He builds the walls and you think, great, this is the peak of the story. But the more he digs into it, he starts opening doors and looking in closets and goes, man, there is still a lot of work to be done here. And he ends the book very anticlimactically. I mean, he essentially says, at the end it says, God, remember me. I tried. I did the best I could. Please remember me because I tried. And it's sort of like a anticlimactic. And Esther is the same way. Like, you read Esther and like, I get it that the Jews' lives were in danger, but like, it almost like the pendulum almost swings the other direction where like, oh no, the Jews are about to be destroyed, but hey, don't worry. Now, like, thousands of other people get to be killed instead. And it's kind of like, Esther is just kind of like, okay, all right. But that's really the whole story of the Bible, is every single story just leaves you kind of going like, well, that was good, but David was great, but, I mean, David did dumb things too. Moses is great, but Moses did some dumb things. Moses didn't get to go to the promised land, right? All that work, and Moses doesn't even get to go to the promised land.
Brian, the only one I would say maybe I disagree on that is the story of Christ.
But that's where I'm going. That's exactly where I'm going. Everything in the Old Testament is pointing to, it's constantly pointing forward, going like, this was great, but this isn't it yet. This is great, but this isn't it yet. This is great, but this isn't it yet. Every single story leaves you going, I'm not sure that that's what I was looking for. And finally, you get to Jesus and you go, oh, Jesus is it. And Jesus even talks about in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44, he talks about everything that is written about me in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the writings. Jesus is the culmination of all that. And I'll just end with this. What Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, Joshua, and Esther accomplished is temporary and partial victory. Jesus does it all and so much more. And that is the point of every book in the Old Testament is it is ushering you along. It's ushering you forward through history saying, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. And you get to Jesus and go, yes, we are finally here. All right. Look, I got to the last slide. That's it.
Jesus is coming. Jesus is here. Jesus is
Exactly, Kim.